Hello and welcome to Choose Your Words Carefully. As I was preparing this today, I kind of changed, or yesterday and in the past I've done Choose Your Words Carefully. I'm thinking Choose Your Words Thoughtfully as we enter into this today. And I just want to remind you here what this session is about. So I'm just going to read the session description. The Individualized Education Plan, or the IEP process, is intended to utilize collaboration to support each child in meeting their full potential. Too often, however, the deficit language in IEPs shifts collaboration away from a strengths-based approach and creates social and emotional stress, causing parent dissatisfaction and a decline in involvement. In this session, participants take the perspective of a parent, that would be me here, navigating a deficit-based system and its emotional impact on the mindset of a parent with special needs. We hope to begin answering the question, how can our language choice support social and emotional engagement for all stakeholders? So really at the heart of this session is this question, how can our language choice support more equitable learning environments for students and families with special needs? And a lot of this is really my own personal story as a parent and as an educator, and how my views really shifted once my son entered the system. So I've been in education about 20 years, and my son is 8. So in the past 12 years, I guess, I had 12 years in education without him, and now he entered at 2 or 3 into early into sort of the assessments for students with special needs and services. So we've been doing that for a while. And my story, as an educator, is I entered teaching accidentally, I say, so through the California teacher shortage exactly 20 years ago. I moved to California after college in a short career in journalism to look for a writing job and sort of live the California lifestyle. And I accidentally fell into subbing, and then there was a teacher who didn't come back from maternity, and there I was. So that's how I entered the teaching profession. I've gone in and out of working with districts, nonprofits. I've done a lot of work around social emotional learning and educator development. And part of the story is sort of my realization after my son of, when I entered the profession, I really, I loved it. I felt like I was helping students. My own experience with adults outside of my parents helping me was very formative. And so I felt like I had this role with students, and yet I didn't know what I was doing. I had never taken a class in education. I had never had any pre-prep programs. And, I was inspired and I believed in all the students. And I can see in hindsight now how for some students, including like had I had my own son in my class, I couldn't have had the ability to meet the student with special needs. And so how this teacher shortage that we face now, and the number of uncredentialed and getting credentialed teachers in special education and general education really does play a role. So while I was emergency credentialed and finding my way, there were certainly emergencies that I wasn't seeing, and that I hope to help others go back and see. And sorry. So here we go. So students, with disabilities make up 11.7% of the population in 2020. And if we include the families in this number, that's a really large number of people that is touched by, by families navigating our system. And what I really hope to talk about here is how the language that has been presented to me as an educator, I can see how our system can improve. And a parent, it's been very challenging and very disengaging and very disheartening at times. to be in the experience with my son, sort of on the inside, right? I want to share with you, I dug this up. This was a letter that was written onto me very early in my career. Miss Childers, you are the best teacher in the world. I'm so lucky to have a teacher like you. This is so, so serious. I wish I had a teacher like you, Miss Childers. I really wish that, the end. And I think the piece that struck me is like that, this is so, so serious. And now that I have a second grader, and I taught second grade in my first year, you know, I didn't know to read IEPs. I didn't know how to contribute. I didn't understand the importance of, you know, this 11% of the population and what their futures might look like based on disabilities. I think it's curious that this student thought it was so, so serious that I was a great teacher. And at the same time, you know, it is so, so serious who's in front of our children and how they communicate with the families. Professionally, you know, I'm an experienced instructional designer. I've focused on integrating social, emotional, and academic development. You can look at my website, www.annchilders.com. I do a lot of public speaking. I'm in instructional design. I've worked a lot of professional development, and I'm also very interested in storytelling. And so this presentation is really the story of me and my son. And as a designer, you know, this is something that I created along the way. With my son in special education, I started to pay much more attention as an educator to statistics of students in special education, and realized through practice, through coaching, and through the experience with my son, you know, how we were getting to rates like this, where, you know, 85% of incarcerated youth have learning and or emotional disabilities. This is from a 2015 report. And what you'll also experience here in my storytelling is a lot of digital design. So, you know, what we really need is educators making connections for the students and for the families. And so, you know, I just kind of, this is my question of like, are we building for brains, or are we building brains or building bars? And I just really recognize that the school to prison pipeline for special education students is a legitimate crisis. And like the student said, this is so, so serious. So here we're really going to look at like deficit language. And you know, when I got my son's first IEP, you know, both me and my spouse were just floored. I was embarrassed as an educator. I was embarrassed as a parent. I couldn't understand how educators could write some of these things about my son. And I started to notice my own desire to collaborate and participate. That if you feel like a system or a person or a group of people or a school has a deficit view of your child, it is so much harder to engage than if they have a strength-based, and how we really need to work on the capacity of building our language so that we can see strengths. So this is sort of the essential of what this session is about. Here's another digital art piece I made. That this is actual data from my son's first IEP. My son is actually at the Monterey Bay Aquarium here. I photoshopped this. But I started to realize, you know, I'm an educator. I'm you know, at the time he was little, say 15-year educator. And you're giving me these graphs and charts. And I mean, I was just so overwhelmed and didn't understand, and was a successful, you know, teacher, leader, and coach, and, you know, public speaker. And so I think there's this idea that like the data is real, the IP is real, but it's can be very inaccessible to families. And I'm very curious about how we can shift and make it more accessible in terms of language, and in terms of, you know, I recognize I have the privilege of being educated. I have college degrees. I'm highly literate. And, you know, I've done a lot of work in terms of equity in education. And I just thought, wow, this is challenging for me. How challenging might it be for people who feel intimidated by the system, for parents who who don't understand any of the jargon. I understand enough, but like these are all real graphs that are embedded in these documents that are ultimately designed to help children and their families. So here we have this, this is the document that's going to create opportunities to equity. And while I have seen some improvement, the deficit language in them has been very challenging and disengaging. So, any parent wants for their child, opportunities, and we need the system and the people in the system to have the language and to see those. I think back to my early career, and I'm sure that I filled out some IEPs not really thinking about this, not understanding the impact. It is so serious, and we're not all prepared. And as a parent on the other side, that's very challenging. So I want to just, in terms of a parent coming to an IEP, this session is sort of centered around one of his early IEPs, but, it's emailed, maybe the day before, a 32-page, individualized education plan and a 21-page assessment report. And I'm a pretty quick reader, and it was like super hard to get through all of this and understand it in time for the meeting. And the quantity of information to help with a 4- and 5-year-old just felt extremely overwhelming. Again, there's a lot of digital art in here, but this is, I took his IEP and put it through a Wordle because I felt like in the IEP, there's nothing that represents my son. There's a lot of analysis. There's a lot of data. There's a lot of charts, but where is the information about who he is? And it felt like the system wasn't seeing him. And so this Wordle actually makes sense because I really failed to find words in here that help understand my son. I see skills, I see score, I see teacher, I see development, I see range, I see ability, but his strengths, who he's bringing, I see scales, I failed to see in the actual language. The other thing of being a parent of a child in special education is the layers of things that come in addition to the IEP. And one thing I've been really struck by is sometimes in the communication, the school's certainty about understanding who this child is through the assessments. And, the layers that a parent goes through if their child is not on a developmental, I don't even like the word norm, but here it is. It's like we've been down rabbit holes on the internet comparing him to his peers. I understand the school standards, and I understand how far he is behind, particularly right now over the pandemic. And I don't really even believe in being behind, but I understand the measures that the school uses. There's spousal viewpoints that are often different. I've gotten, emails and letters from families. We're concerned about Eli, like, we think he has autism, or, just whatever it is, that the tagline. And then there's all the medical care and doctor's visits. And so the point here with this slide is, like, when a parent comes to the meeting for a child with an IEP, they have navigated certainly all of these things plus more. And the sensitivity in which you address the parents' efforts, I felt personally could be improved. And I'm going to go into the doctor's visits and medical tests a little bit more later. But my point being, before I even read this or he gets assessed in school, I've dealt with all of these things. So this is a video that I made sort of out of artistry and pain out of the first IEP that we received. Okay, thank you for engaging with that. That always brings tears to my eyes, no matter how many times. And I've had it on YouTube and not had it on YouTube and showed it at conferences. And as my son gets older, honestly, last year we had some challenges with some parents at the school, and um, I didn't want them to hear what other people had said, and in a way that feels so shaming. Um, and then an educator, I think, well, as a parent, that's how I feel, and as an educator, I think, we really have to be clear about how we're reframing deficit-based language, and that, the teachers, including myself, only really see students inside of four walls, and that is not a whole child approach. And how really getting curious, my son continues to have challenges with peer age relationships. He does great with older kids and younger kids. And so, how, as a disengaged parent, if I feel disengaged, like, I want you to see my son. I want the educators to see my son. And so it's so important that we keep parents engaged so that they can help see these strengths of their child that teachers can't often see, and that getting curious really helps. I have found is one of the most helpful tools as an educator to finding the strengths of students, because this is really about language for a whole student approach. Okay. So strengths, and how do we define strengths? That really kind of became a question for me after this experience with my son, and really digging in and reframing this language for myself, because I got his IEP and I wrote down on a piece of paper, just processing, like in tears, all the language that felt deficit based. And then I took that and started saying, what is the school not seeing? What's the system not seeing? What are the teachers not seeing? And then it really got me thinking to, how do we define strengths? Because strengths are not fixed personality traits. My son, some of these things that were said about him, that's not him. Strengths develop from a dynamic contextual process rooted deeply in one's culture. My son is fascinated with the ocean. He understands waves. He's not a swimmer yet because of his physical disability, but he loves waves. He can read waves. He can know when a big wave's coming. His ability to understand the ocean is really, that's part of our culture here in our house. I mean, I'm a surfer and we love the beach, and he has this strength that, the school doesn't see. And also, this is another definition of strengths, is a strengths may be defined as that which helps a person to cope with life, or that which makes life more fulfilling for oneself and others. And I read a book by Dave Grohl. He's a rock and roll singer of the Foo Fighters, but his mom wrote a book where she interviewed other rock musicians' parents. And throughout the book, the theme was that these former students who were now, well-established musicians with amazing careers, didn't get along in school. And it's so interesting to me that, where our definition of strengths as an educators come from. And this idea that if we're not seeing students' strengths, we might not see their culture. And this can be a big divide. The IEP, the language is the parents are asked for inputs, but it's very technical, right? There's nothing cultural that comes forth, and how that might impact people who are coming from non-dominant cultures into school systems, and the varying of strengths that what a teacher might see as a strength might be different than the parents see as a strength. And so how do we kind of reckon with this in education, and the importance of seeing the strengths in every child, right? The school, the IEP, they don't see my son's fascination with the ocean. They don't see that he makes up and processes via songs, right? It's like the technical part is missing a cultural piece that, as a parent, I feel like I want you to see my son. This is who he is, and where's the space for that? as I kind of kept going along in this journey, I had, other educators who also had students with IEPs. I got into some interesting conversations. This is from a friend of mine who's an assistant superintendent. And during one of her child's IEPs meeting, one of his teachers said, well, he's not the lowest in the class, which was followed by another teacher chiming in, I even have kids with disabilities lower. And this is so the deficit based. Where's the strengths to build on? Where's the recognition of what this child brings? So again, going back to like this deficit language, because what I see as a educational practitioner is that our language has the potential to engage or disengage parents, because I have become that parent who, if you don't see my son, it's harder for me to engage. And I love education. I could talk about education all day, and I love my son. I could talk about him all day, but about his strengths and what he brings. I do want to give some positive examples here of language that has really helped support us and made me feel engaged as a parent. And over Zoom, Eli had a special education teacher that was this speech teacher that for the first time engaged us in the goals. And so I'm sharing part of an email with you here. She writes, I hope you had a great weekend. Talks about Eli's IEP, but she wanted to run it by us, which was the first time anybody has actually asked me to engage in his goals, and so, and also this emphasis on strategies that we could use, because we knew the belly breaths. So she, his goal was about him using the strategies. And so as a parent, I can engage in the goals by asking him if he's using his strategies. Thankfully, she came up with strategies that I could also engage with in terms of belly breath, increased volume, reduced rate of speech, over articulation, and big speech. And that it was really his goals were about using the strategies. And she asks, like, was this what you had in mind? Feel free to make any changes, additions, or suggestions. I welcome any edits. I was like, wow, she actually sees me as a partner. I feel like a partner in here. I want to engage. I want this relationship. She, I'm going to share both, a few more of both examples, language that has, and when I say I feel disengaged from my son's education, it just means the language feels like you're not seeing him. And that battle can become kind of, it can become challenging amongst all the other things that we're dealing with as parents. So that was like a positive experience I had as he's progressed through school, of the engagement. This is kind of the opposite, the same special education team, but so Eli was in kindergarten in 1920. So we did distance learning, once the pandemic hit. He was home with us starting in March. And so I was really, one thing I found very disengaging in that was and it was a stressful time. I think the impacts of the pandemic were felt by all, but I noticed his sort of levels of anxiety were high, as rightfully so. But the school attempted to do a behavioral report assessed by a kindergartner on Zoom during the pandemic. And I just, for one, my response to that was, you're making a behavioral plan he was switching schools. We are now at an alternative school that's a much better fit for him. But you're making an assessment on a child that is in a pandemic, the beginning of a pandemic, and he's as a kindergartner on Zoom. And you essentially don't know him, nor are you asking us about him before you created this behavioral plan for a school that he had never been to, that a completely different design. So, as an educator, I know that environment makes a difference in a child's behavior, to the point of, we've had developmental pediatricians tell us, try several schools before, so you understand how he responds to different environments. And that's, coming from Stanford's pediatrics. So A couple things here that I want to share. First of all, the confidential behavior and intervention plan, there's a piece that feels sort of shaming around the confidential piece, like why, like, he might need some different supports. That's okay. Um, and so when we got to this point in the IEP, because we did the Zoom, and both my spouse and I were really upset by this behavior plan. We felt like it had identified things for him that he wasn't identified with, and just sort of like the plug and play pieces of the IEP. And this is my spouse Cameron here in the picture with Eli, and we were in the IEP meeting, and I said I agree to all the goals. We had a great conversation, but the behavior plan made on Zoom in a pandemic through observation on video, for a school he's never been to, let's skip that, and let's make one if he needs it at his new school. And the team continued to press on this, and at one point my spouse just kind of burst into tears and left the room, and I stopped them and I said, you've just lost the most important person in this child's life in terms of their engagement with school. And it took a big pause for the group, but I just really think unlike the speech therapist, are these his goals? What do you think? This kind of blindsided us. And when expressing that it was upsetting and didn't feel right for us, we were ignored until, be getting so upset that my spouse had to leave the room. So, I think there's a couple things here. I mean, I picked out things that are challenging to me because I also wonder how, some of the language that was hard was like fidget objects available to Eli in class. Like, we all know fidget objects as educators are great. Like, I just sometimes wonder how, going outside to take a breath or using a fidget object became a necessary part of an IEP, that should really be available to all students. Secondly, and then, the goals and accommodations could actually meet his individual needs. And then, this one, and I'm not a behavioral therapist, but, my son he has not been, I felt like this is something that was designed for another kid and sort of plugged in. But I worried as a parent. I read this and it says, ignore the disruption if the comment or noise Eli is making is not related to the instructional activity. And as a person who's taught primary grades, you can be reading about horses and somebody can tell you their dad died. I don't think it's appropriate to ignore it. It's this sort of formulaicness that is challenging when I think, okay, I know why these things are done, but in practice as a family member, it does not feel helpful. So again, the deficit language, like making it hard to participate, or the strengths base, really like, okay, the strategies, I can engage in those. The educator sees me as a collaborator. Or almost caught up to where I am with my son, so bear with me. But this summer, Eli had an opportunity to go to summer school, and I got a call the third day of summer school that he had fallen from a structure and was really upset. And when I went to go pick him up, his face looked like this. And I could go on and on, but ultimately the school didn't know what had happened to him. And so I engaged in conversations around, obviously like school safety and some things that came into about, but, I wanted an incident report because he had had some medical issues during the pandemic, including a fractured vertebrae, essentially a broken back. And, I'm going to go here. 2 months later, this report arrives that I'd asked for, that says that it should come within 24 hours. And I felt so disengaged by the system that as an educator, I understand these things don't happen very often. And I understand summer school and the pandemic, everything is very, very hectic, but I felt very dismissed as a parent. And when I had asked about, he didn't return to that school. That's how, it was summer school. That's how disengaged I felt, that I was worried about his safety there, based on what I had seen and what I'd heard in the conversations. And the principal at the time in an email told me, I'm sorry you're frustrated. And I think that is language that that's putting the onus on me, and that I should be frustrated as a parent of a child in special education if I pay attention to any of the statistics. And this is, in Santa Cruz County, and, we can all look at dashboard data and we all know there's room for special education and programs to improve. But the I'm sorry you're frustrated, talking to parents of marginalized students and saying that they're frustrated was just sort of a shocking approach to me. I'm not I'm sorry about the injury. I'm sorry the systems weren't set up to protect him, or I'm sorry that we didn't know what had happened. So this was just really kind of recent. And but the language in the communication is always what I pay attention to. And when I sort of pressed on some of the system in terms of like, and I offered, hey, can you have a redo, as a parent I can come and talk to you about like what might have been helpful. I felt ignored. I wasn't given more options. And the administrator wrote and told me, as a department, we take pride in the support and coaching provided to our special education teams. In addition, we are grateful to the collaboration we have with our general education colleagues and administrators. And I pointed out to this administrator that what's missing here is the parent. Where's the parent collaboration, right? This can't be the school system in and of itself. This isn't about collaboration amongst themselves as educators. It's about collaboration with parents. And it's just another example of a time where I really sort of felt as though I didn't have a voice in the system. And that part's really painful, because I understand it, and I understand, ways and things that can help improve. This is Eli's current principal, who on the right here is a picture. This is a positive example of language. And she called me when they had some opportunities for him to come back to school. And this was still during the pandemic. And we kind of started the conversation, and he had just started this school in first grade, so he was only on Zoom. And then the opportunity came, and there's a picture of Eli on the right with his back brace, because he wore this for 3 months for his vertebrae. And so we got into conversation. Okay, we have a spot for some of the students to come back, just a few. And she gave me some kind of outlines of the time frames, and I said, well, are you flexible? Like, he's had this injury, and I'm not sure he can make it to school all day right now. He's got this, there's a lot of sort of physical challenges. And finally she quieted, and she said to me, I'm here to serve your child. And if I tear up, it's because all of this is very emotional, but those simple words were so healing as a parent, to find somebody who saw me as a partner, and that they were here to serve my child. And I share that with administrators and educators, because I think it's such a great line. And then here's another story of a success story of language. And Eli loves to play basketball, and yet some of his physical disabilities, he's now, amongst second graders, and their basketball games just a little bit more intense than his abilities at the moment. But he loves basketball. I mean, you can see here, he's trying to make a basket in the big hoop, and he'll sit here and shoot, like, I think we were at the park, he can make it on this kind of mini hoop at home like 50 times, 100 times. He just keeps trying. But I invited the administrator to share an example of how she helped with inclusivity, and in a way that I have you listen to here.
Hi, my name is Michelle McKinney, and I'm the principal at Monarch Community School in Santa Cruz City Schools. We are a small alternative parent participation school that honors multi-age classrooms. This year, we have a student who has an IEP and is working on academic, occupational therapy, and speech and language goals. This youngster is also working on learning how to interact successfully with peers, and we've been trying to serve them by collecting data around what parts of the day are particularly challenging and which are successful. We've also noticed that the student has been very interested in enjoying a fairly raucous game of basketball during the recess times, which is mostly played by older students. Earlier in the year, we believe that this student has tried to enter the game and was feeling that the other students would never pass the ball to them. After I found this out, I hovered at the basketball game for a few days, and when the younger student approached, I asked them if they wanted to play the game. They said yes, and I asked the older players to pause the game for a minute so that the student could get information about which team they would be on, the rules of the game, and other guidelines for playing this game. One of the older students said to me, "It's hard to pass to them because they don't know how to play the game." I asked the players if there was a way that they could think about how to include the student in the game. The student's solution was to always have the less experienced student be the person to throw the ball in when it went out of bounds. This was very successful throughout the entire game. So the next day, I went out to supervise recess, and our students had picked up the game exactly where it left off, including the group's solution of having our younger student be included by always throwing the ball in after an out of bounds event. I just love the way that the solutions already reside within the young people, and that generally kids really do want to include others. Sometimes they just need a little encouragement.
So that was an example of a very inclusive experience where we all ended up, my son was happy and he can play and has a role, and I just so appreciate the approach of inclusivity. So the activity here now, let me go forward here. So I think really what I'm asking here is like, how can we see strengths and provide pathways to meeting goals so that, this does become access to education, and, language does impact our social emotional well-being. It does as a parent, more than anything I find. And that words do have a tremendous power to define the way we see ourselves, the world, and our communities. And we can lead to seeing more students by first focusing on inclusive language and strengths. So in the PowerPoint here now, the activity, I actually have a sample of the actual IEP with names omitted. If you link to this PDF, and you can think about opportunities to shift language. And so like sort of practical application here, and there is a Padlet that has the PDF, and you can add examples. These are some resources and tools I use for reframing. And I just want to say thank you for listening to my story as a parent and educator. And thank you to the Santa Clara County Office of Education. This is one of my favorite places to present, and I hope we can do it in person next time, as inclusion is so important for all families. Thank you.